Welcome back to the county seat. We are continuing our online conversation on the issue of spruce bark beetle on the Dixie National Forest and the issue of beetle infestations in forests in general here in the state of Utah. Been a very lively discussion. We are continuing it as we often do on thecountyseat.tv. Thanks for tuning in. Gentlemen, let's continue the conversation.
It's not so much relevant to the supplying, really good quality jobs to rural communities. It's not right on point with that, but one of my pet peeves and one of the things that keeps me energized on my work is when the Forest Service again and again and again keeps coming up with projects, such as in this Engelmann spruce salvage areas, and saying we need to salvage log to reduce an increase in fire danger that's resulted from the beetle outbreak. Whereas the peer-reviewed journal literature on this is increasingly and incredibly clear in that, in fact, there's either no increase in risk of fire after a beetle outbreak, and in places above certain elevations, statistically significant decreased risk of spread and intensity of a fire in spruce forest.
And Kevin, I'll take your word on that, but from a layman's perspective, as a guy who doesn't know trees, I see a gray dead tree and I think, okay, when I throw a log like that in a campfire, it goes boom. Yeah. And when I take something that's still got some sap in it, boy, it's just not going to burn very well.
The supposition here is that the most flammable part of the forest here is the green needles. Or actually the most flammable part is the brown and reddish needles before they've fallen off a tree. But once those needles have dropped off the trees and onto the forest floor, say maybe 3-4 years after the beetle outbreak goes through, the risk of a start and a spread and the risk of the intensity level of a fire, if it does start, all those measurements of fires go down after the needles fall off the trees. And it's not until a new forest comes up, say 50 to 100 plus years later, where you have, again, a green forest with a closed canopy of green branches interlocking, that the fire danger, again, goes up. So it's actually the green needles that's the highest risk.
So that keep the forest running and harvested, so that when they get to the point where they are touching you or to restart again, wouldn't that overall reduce on the long term?
If you keep the crown, technically what you're getting at is if you keep the crowns of the trees from touching, the risk of a fire spreading from the crown of one tree to the next would go down. That's something that people are researching right now, and it's been researched in Ponderosa, down lower, but not in spruce.
I don't think we need to keep these forests at a state of risk, constant risk all the time. There are means and measures by which they can stay opened up, they can stay thrifty, they can stay productive, and remember, these are forest ecosystems that other critters and biota depend upon. And they don't need to go up in smoke, and they don't need to be wiped out. I think the public looks at these forests in this state and they're wondering, what in the devil happened? Why?
Well, okay, a fair question. You were talking about being up in the Cascades and looking at Weyerhaeuser's holdings up in the Cascades. Yes. I've not been there. When was the last time they had a fire?
Oh, their fire, I don't know on Weyerhaeuser lands, but I do know that the fire return intervals in much of the Cascades, because it's such a wet forest, the wetter the forest is, the longer the fire return interval is. For example, when settlers came out to the Pacific Northwest, much of the Douglas fir was about 800 years old. That's that classic Doug fir old growth. And it's long been believed that that's a result of a stand-replacing fire about 800 years ago, which somehow correlates with the mini ice age or something to that effect. So even in those forests, the process involves really long periods of time between forests. It's in the Ponderosa pine forests, which do exist on the Dixie and which we haven't talked about, where there's an argument to be made to thin out the forests, to restore them to a more grassland type fire regime where you have fires coming through the forest floor every 5 to 20 years or so.
Okay, when you drive up to West Yellowstone through Island Park, as soon as you leave St. Anthony and Ashton and climb up that grade, you see signs. and when they planted them. And so obviously there was a Forest Service harvest there, and then they reseeded them. That's a pretty healthy stretch of land across there, as far as I can see, and it looks like it takes 20 or 30 years to get them back up to what you'd call a forest height again. But it looks like they've got some kind of progressive management program where they're recycling through on that. What's the problem with management like that, or is there?
I think from a standpoint of silviculture, you know, it comes down to two issues. You know, what makes sense biologically, and the other is what makes sense socially, for the lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. And those stands that you just described were clear cut in the 60s. Mm-hmm. In progressive steps,
yeah,
you know,
88.
and then 80s.
You've seen that sign?
Yeah.
But I think that for some time to come, we'll be looking at selective harvest as a means of taking care of these issues and thinning it out, so that, you know, that folks will always think there's a forested appearance without worried about somebody first making a dollar.
So that is an added cost, though, to selectively harvest, is it not? It's more expensive than clear cutting?
It costs more, but it depends upon the product values and the length of contract, but it's very eminently doable. And we used to do that.
Would that be a good compromise?
What you're looking at up there is the lodgepole pine forest of Middle Rocky Mountain ecosystem, which is different from the Dixie, very different. And there you have lodgepole pine, which is generally thought of as an early successional tree. That is, it comes back after a stand replacing fire. It's kind of like, well, aspen in many cases is an early successional tree.
It's one
as
of
well.
the first to recover from a fire,
Right.
is what you're saying.
Right.
I'm trying to get to that jargon.
Yeah,
thing
serotinous
again.
cones that open up after the heat of a fire.
fire,
Yeah, so that's lodgepole pine. So it's more likely to be a natural state where you have an even age stand in lodgepole. For that reason.
Would you advocate clear cutting then?
I would not advocate clear cutting in lodgepole.
I didn't think you would.
No.
Okay.
I think that if you're going to do logging there, it should be at a sustainable rate with selective tree logging, where you maintain a mixed forest structure that includes some old growth forest structure that can be done and is done in some places.
See, the access is
in other
already
parts
in.
of the West.
The investments for roads and all that are already in, so you can actually do that probably more readily than they used to.
Okay, so Kevin, this is a question specifically for you, because I think I know where your answer would be on this. If you look at the issue of the communities that rely upon timber, you look at the demand for timber in the marketplace, because we have it. We're importing a lot of stuff that could be available from home. So you look at that economic side. You look at the other side of the issue about appearance of the forest, because part of the forest's mission is obviously sustained yield, but it's also recreational. And an appearance does become an issue that's a manageable issue. So when you're looking at all of these issues that environmentalism, recreation, economy, forest health, and everything, it may not be a perfect environmental, as Jim described, glass over the top of it, natural system. But wouldn't selective harvesting be a compromise point that would be a pretty good point for long-term sustainability in a forest?
There is a place for that, absolutely. I don't think the place for that is at 10 and 11,000 feet in the Engelmann spruce belt on the Dixie. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I actually love going in forests where you have really large live and dead trees, and I find it to be very sad when I go into some of those areas, such as the Sydney Peak Salvage, and you see it littered with big old stumps and very young, you would call it thrifty forest coming up, which you see as a good thing, and I see as a forest that's lost its biological legacy.
Would you just park it then?
No, it's constantly changing.
You would just park it.
Park it means it stays static, right?
Well, park it means you just wouldn't maintain it, I think is where he's coming from. You just let it take its natural course.
Well, the beetle outbreak is not the time to go in and produce timber. That's like kicking the system when it's down.
Manage the ecosystem as opposed to producing timber. Those are your words.
The time to do that is not when you already have a severe event happening and the forest is changing into a new cycle and a new life pattern. That's not the time to go in. The time to go into a forest is when it's in a more resilient state.
I'd agree with you. I'd agree with you.
So,
but you just said that,
the
spruce forests are off limits for that.
Well, they're not productive as far as lower elevation forests. I don't find them to be.
Yeah. The highest values in this recession, once again, came out of spruce for house logs, of all things.
That may be true, but
it is true.
But the Dixie has been experiencing more no-bid sales in the last few years. There are projects where they've been bid at least twice, one on Mount Dutton, where it's spruce salvage, and nobody's placing a bid.
Why?
There's no demand.
So you're going to take the risk and have a contract hung around your neck if you don't know if there's an outlet for it and you got all that responsibility?
Right.
This thing has to be economically viable.
There are some in the timber industry. I've read timber industry rags in the last couple of years increasingly talking about existing timber industry inventories on lots as if it was something akin to the toxic assets of the housing market. That is, it's so hard to, they're toxic not because they're poisonous, but because timber economists are having a hard time assessing and assigning value to those timber inventories because nobody wants it. There's no demand. It's hard to assign a value when there's no demand for something. So,
but the implication was there's no bid sales and it's somebody's fault.
Well, no. I think that people may be overestimating the value or the demand that's there.
Oh, wow.
So
for a few years now, you're going to pretty well have your way, economically, I mean.
We'll see how things go. And timber is a lot more productive in other parts of the country, southeast, northwest, private Weyerhaeuser lands, which are low elevation, some of the most productive lands in the world, as a matter of fact.
Stand in the town.
That's where it's more appropriate to have timber harvest for production.
Stand in the town squares at Escalante, Circleville, and Panguitch and call for a crowd and make that statement. I challenge you.
Okay.
Gentlemen, this has been a very productive debate. If you have tuned in to watch this, I encourage you to take these areas of economics, ecology, forest appearance, health, recreation, take the entire picture that's part of that Forest Service mission and continue this dialogue and then share your opinion. We have a Facebook page for the county seat, and you can go there and make your comments. We would love to hear from them. Thank you for joining us on this website extended version of the county seat. We'll look for you next week, as always, on the county seat, Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. on ABC4. Thank you for joining us. Guys, this was great.